Well, hey guys, picture this. You're stuck in a never-ending traffic jam, but the honking cars dissolve into ghostly lanterns, and a colossal moon-lit balloon rolls up like a shy UFO, offering a one-way ticket out of the gridlock. And trust me, the only thing you'll need to dodge is the occasional mischievous night breeze. So before we float away, smash that like button if you love a good escape, and drop a comment telling me the weirdest place you've ever tried to nap. Now dim the lights, slide into your comfiest pillow fort, maybe sip something warm, and let's drift together. You step into the wicker basket, and the canvas sighs like a tired cat. The cool air smells faintly of pine and midnight jasmine, while distant crickets play a lullaby that could make even a coffee-addicted night owl yawn. Is this a dream? You whisper, and the balloon replies with a soft creak that sounds suspiciously like a chuckle, reminding you that gravity is just a suggestion tonight. Let me know in the comments if you've ever chased a night sky adventure in real life, and stay tuned as we glide toward a sleep-inducing horizon you'll swear was written by the universe's own bedtime storyteller. In the sleepy hamlet of Lumenvale, the cobblestones still smelled of damp pine and yesterday's stew as the sun yawned behind the ridge. Myra, a spry 12-year-old with a knot of braids, darted between the thatched roofs, her laughter echoing like a wind chime in a storm. Her grandfather, a wiry man with a beard that seemed to have its own weather patterns, hauled a bright, silvery balloon onto the village square, its fabric shimmering like a freshly polished spoon. He muttered about the balloon's lineage, claiming it was older than the village well and twice as stubborn, while Myra rolled her eyes and pretended not to be impressed. The air grew cooler, and the first crickets began their nightly chorus, setting the stage for a night that would feel like a page ripped from an old legend. The duo set to work, unspooling the balloon's massive envelope with the care of surgeons handling a particularly temperamental organ. The canvas crackled under Myra's fingers, releasing a faint scent of burnt rubber and lavender, an odd combination that reminded her of her mother's secret perfume. Grandfather's hands, calloused from decades of rope work, tied the gondola with a knot he swore was taught by a pirate who once tried to steal the moon, and Myra couldn't help but snicker at the melodrama. As they filled the balloon with warm air from a makeshift burner, the flame sputtered and hissed, sending a puff of soot that tickled Myra's nose like a mischievous pixie. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleated in protest, as if demanding a share of the adventure, and the grandfather chuckled, promising the goat a souvenir moon rock if it behaved. While the balloon swelled, grandfather leaned close, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of a storyteller at a campfire. He spoke of ancient skywalkers, those daring souls who once leapt from cliff tops on moonlit breezes, their capes fluttering like superhero capes in a Marvel movie, except with less CGI and more actual danger. Myra imagined them soaring over deserts of sand that glittered like spilled sugar, dodging dragons that sneezed stardust, and she giggled at the thought of a skywalker accidentally landing in a farmer's barn and being mistaken for a particularly large chicken. The old man winked, adding that the skywalkers always left behind a tiny trinket, usually a feather or a forgotten sock, as proof of their passage. Myra's eyes widened. She vowed to find such a relic, even if it meant rummaging through the balloon's cargo like a pirate searching for buried treasure. As the sun slipped behind the hills, the sky turned a bruised violet, and the first shy stars peeked out, winking like mischievous fireflies. The village lanterns flickered on, casting amber pools of light that danced on the cobblestones, while the balloon's silver skin caught the twilight and glowed like a giant moon pie. A gentle breeze whispered through the valley, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant pine resin, urging the balloon to lift. Myra felt her heart thump in her throat, a drumbeat that matched the distant hoot of an owl perched on a crooked fence post. Grandfather lifted his weathered hat, tipped it toward the horizon, and declared, "Tonight we'll ride the night's back porch. The moon will be our neighbor and the stars our ceiling fans." Finally the burner roared to life, spitting a plume of orange fire that hissed against the cool air, and the balloon shivered as if waking from a long nap. The gondola creaked, the ropes sang a low metallic note, and Myra clutched the edge, feeling the vibrations travel up to her fingertips like a secret Morse code. With a gentle heave, the balloon rose, pulling away from the village square, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the faint echo of a goat's disgruntled bleat. Myra's breath caught as the world fell away, the houses turning into tiny toy blocks, the river into a silver ribbon glinting under the moon's watchful eye. Grandfather's chuckle floated up to her, warm and reassuring, as he whispered, "Welcome to the Skywalkers Club. Membership includes free nighttime views and occasional encounters with mischievous clouds." The hamlet of Lumenvale settled like a shy cat beneath the amber blush of dusk. Tiny thatched roofs exhaled warm rosemary smoke that curled into the cooling air. In the courtyard, Myra, 12 and forever curious, tugged at the rope of a silvery balloon that shimmered like a spilled mirror. Her grandfather, a wiry man with laugh lines deeper than the village well, handed her a basket lined with patched wool. Together they watched the last gold sliver of sun crawl behind the hills, feeling the world tilt toward night. The balloon's envelope smelled of fresh goat cheese and burnt pine, a scent that made Myra's nose wrinkle with delight. Grandfather chuckled, saying the fabric had been soaked in dragon breath perfume to keep the winds friendly. He unrolled the ropes, each coil snapping like a rubber band in a cartoon, and secured the copper gondola with brass bolts that clinked like coins in a pirate's chest. The wandering goat bleated a warning, as if auditioning for a cameo in a medieval sitcom, and Myra laughed, promising it a seat among the stars. The basket filled with loaves of rye, a jar of honey that stuck to the lid, and a battered copy of Star Trek. The original voyage, for good measure. As twilight deepened, Grandfather began his tale of the ancient skywalkers, the luminous nomads who rode comets like surfboards. He described how they stitched constellations from moonbeams and sang lullabies that made meteors wobble like drunk dancers. Myra imagined a skywalker balancing on a moonlit rope, slipping on a stray comet tail and shouting, "Houston, we have a bounce." The old man winked, noting that even the gods needed a good joke before they could climb the heavens. The stars twinkled in rhythm, as if applauding the absurdity of their own myths. The sun's final gasp painted the clouds in bruised purples, and a chilly breeze whispered through the wheat fields, smelling faintly of damp earth and distant campfires. Fireflies turned on like tiny spotlights, their flickers competing with the first shy stars that pricked the sky. Myra felt her heart thump like a drum in a marching band, half excited, half nervous about the altitude-induced ear pop. Grandfather tightened the last knot, reminding her that the balloon would rise on hope, not on horsepower, and that gravity was just a very persistent party pooper. The lone owl hooted, seemingly quoting Shakespeare. To fly or not to fly, that is the question, and Myra giggled at the bird's theatrical timing. With a heave, the balloon shivered and slipped from the earth, tugging on Myra's boots like a mischievous toddler. The basket rose, swaying above the thatched roofs, the village shrinking into a patchwork quilt of amber and shadow. Grandfather's voice rode the wind, singing an old lullaby about moonbeams that taste like lavender and citrus, soothing the balloon's creaking frame. Myra clutched the rope, feeling the cool night air slap her cheeks, scented with pine sap and distant campfire smoke. Above Lumenvale, the skywalkers of legend seemed to wink, and the balloon drifted toward the moon, a silver lantern guiding sleepy souls toward dreamland. The night sky unfurled like an ancient tapestry, and Myra's moonlit balloon nudged awake from its tether. It rose with the grace of a court jester's feathered hat, drifting past towering pines that stood like stoic sentinels. The basket's canvas creaked, a low, familiar sigh that reminded her of wooden ships swaying on a calm sea. Below, the forest's dark canopy turned into a patchwork quilt of shadow and silver. She inhaled the cool air, feeling the world shrink to a model village beneath her. A soft, cool breeze slipped through the pine needles, carrying the sharp perfume of resin and earth-wet moss. The scent tickled Myra's nostrils like a mischievous pixie, making her grin despite the chill. As the balloon glided higher, the ground's details blurred into a watercolor smear, and the pine trunk seemed to whisper ancient gossip. A distant owl hooted, its call echoing like a lone saxophone in a jazz club at 2 a.m. The sound nudged her thoughts toward the mysteries that linger above, where stars gossip in riddles. The owl's hoot struck a chord of irony. Here she was, floating like a balloon-bound superhero, yet the night's only sidekick was a bird that could see in the dark. Myra chuckled, picturing the owl wearing a tiny cape and shouting, "To the Bat Cave," as it swooped past. The wind tugged at her hair, scattering a few stray pine needles that stuck to her cheek like tiny, prickly kisses. She felt a sudden, gritty reminder that the basket's leather seat was damp with sweat and a faint hint of burnt campfire ash. Still, the humor warmed her like a mug of cocoa, even as the night air brushed her skin with the bite of a winter's bite. In a voice that might have been Herodotus narrating a midnight saga, the night seemed to unfold layer by layer, each pine a chapter of forgotten wars. Myra imagined the trees as ancient soldiers, their bark scarred by time, their roots tangled like the plot of a soap opera. The balloon's flame flickered, sending up a wisp of smoke that smelled faintly of burnt marshmallows, a nostalgic reminder of summer camp mischief. Somewhere far below, a river gurgled, sounding like a chorus of disgruntled frogs arguing over a lost sock. The combination of these sounds stitched a tapestry of comfort and chaos, coaxing her mind toward the soft edge of sleep. As the balloon drifted higher, the world below turned into a speck of dust, and Myra felt the weight of earthly worries dissolve like sugar in tea. The owl's call faded into a lullaby, and the pine-scented wind wrapped around her like a well-worn blanket. She smiled at the absurdity of soaring above the whispering pines, as if she'd stepped onto the set of a low-budget fantasy film. The night whispered, "Rest now, brave traveler," and the balloon rocked gently, cradling her in a cradle of moonlight. With a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a sigh from a tired narrator, she surrendered to sleep, the stars blinking approvingly above. A thin, luminous fog slipped over the valley like a ghostly silk curtain, catching the moon's pale grin and turning it into a pearly halo around the balloon. The night air smelled of damp earth and distant pine resin, a perfume that would have made a medieval apothecary blush. Below, the river glimmered like a spilled bottle of liquid silver, its surface rippling in time with the balloon's gentle sway. Myra, perched in the wicker basket, felt the world soften as if someone had turned down the volume on a bustling tavern. The fog wrapped the craft in a veil that made the whole scene look like an old-time sepia photograph come alive. Myra reached for the lantern, her fingers brushing the brass handle that had survived more storms than a pirate ship's mast. She steadied the flame, whispering a quiet promise to the fire that it would not sputter, even as the mist tried to choke its glow. The lantern's amber light flickered in rhythm with her heartbeat, a metronome that kept the night from spiraling into chaos. She recalled a line from a Shakespeare play, "All the world's a stage," and imagined the fog as a shy audience waiting for her solo. With a grin that would have made a court jester jealous, she tipped the lantern toward the veil, coaxing the fog to part like a reluctant curtain. The silver fog pressed closer, testing Myra's resolve as if it were a mischievous cat batting at a dangling feather. Yet the silence that followed was not the hollow kind that haunts haunted houses. It was a deep, soothing hush, like the pause before a grand orchestra's finale. Each breath she drew tasted of cool metal and faint ozone, reminding her that the world still spun, even if the stars were hiding behind a gauzy screen. She laughed softly, thinking of how the ancient Greeks might have called this a divine nap for the heavens. The balloon bobbed gently, its rope creaking in sympathy, while Myra's confidence swelled like a well-tuned lute. Even as the fog thickened, the basket's canvas released a faint scent of burnt wool and old leather, a reminder that adventure always carries a whiff of sweat and soot. Somewhere far below, a lone owl hooted, its call echoing like a distant saxophone solo in a jazz club. A stray moth, confused by the lantern's glow, fluttered into the basket, its wings brushing Myra's cheek with a ticklish, almost comical irritation. The wind whispered through the fog, sounding oddly like the rustle of parchment in a medieval scriptorium, and Myra imagined scribes jotting down the tale of a night when the moon decided to wear a veil. She felt the balloon's ropes vibrate with a low, comforting hum, as if the whole world were humming a lullaby to coax her into sleep. When the fog finally lifted, it left behind a sky so clear it could have been painted by a Renaissance master with a brush dipped in starlight. Myra tipped her lantern one last time, sending a final flare of amber that shot upward like a tiny fireworks display, an ironic nod to the 4th of July, though she was far from any barbecue. The balloon drifted onward, its silhouette now a sleek silver arrow cutting through the night, and Myra felt a quiet triumph that would make even a stoic Roman general crack a smile. She settled back, letting the calm rhythm of the flame lull her thoughts into a gentle drift, as if the night itself were a giant, cozy blanket. And as the moon peeked through the remaining wisps, it seemed to wink, saying, "You survived the silver fog, now go get some sleep, you brave night owl." The night had been a thick broth of fog, clinging to the hills like a damp blanket. Myra steadied the wicker basket of the moonlit balloon, its canvas creaking under the weight of anticipation. A gentle gust tugged at the envelope, coaxing it upward through the mist as if the sky itself were pulling a rope. Below, the world smelled of damp pine and distant campfires, a rustic perfume that made her throat tingle. She inhaled, laughed at the absurdity of floating like a Victorian explorer with a Netflix subscription. Then, as if a celestial tailor had finally finished his work, the full moon slipped through the clouds and crowned the night with a silver diadem. Its light poured over the balloon, turning the canvas into a shimmering sail of molten pewter. The glow painted every rope and brass fitting with a soft, almost mischievous gleam, like a Hollywood set lit for a romantic comedy. Crickets chirped a staccato rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a metronome ticking down to a grand reveal. Myra felt the air vibrate, a subtle hum that reminded her of an old vinyl record warming up. That silver flood awakened something ancient in Myra's chest, a lullaby her grandmother used to hum while kneading dough in a cramped kitchen. The melody rose like steam from a kettle, curling around the balloon's rim and slipping into her ears. Each note was a grain of memory, the scent of fresh bread, the rough feel of burlap sacks, the distant echo of a church bell on Sunday mornings. She sang it silently, her voice a whisper that the wind refused to carry away, as if the night itself were listening. The lullaby tugged at the corners of her mind, reminding her that even in the vastness of the heavens, home is a heartbeat away. As the balloon drifted higher, the world below turned into a patchwork quilt of dark fields and glittering rivers. Myra's heart swelled with a serene climax of wonder, each breath tasting of cool night air tinged with ozone, like after a summer thunderstorm. The horizon glowed with quiet awe, every hill a soft silhouette against the moon's gentle tyranny. Stars peppered the sky, daring each other to outshine the moon, while a lone owl hooted in a tone that sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic commentator. The balloon rocked ever so slightly, and she felt the universe cradling her in its vast, indifferent embrace. In that moment, time seemed to stretch like taffy, sweet and endless. She thought of the scene as the ultimate crossover episode, part Star Wars Cantina, part Lord of the Rings Council, all wrapped in a Netflix binge-watch vibe. The balloon's basket smelled faintly of burnt marshmallows from a campfire she'd left behind, a reminder that even lofty adventures can get a little sticky. A stray moth fluttered by, its wings beating like tiny drums, and Myra chuckled at the irony of a creature so tiny daring to challenge the moon's spotlight. She whispered a thank you to the night, half expecting a reply from a distant satellite, and half hoping the moon would drop a souvenir like a cosmic souvenir shop. With a sigh that sounded like a sighing wind through an old library, she settled into the quiet, ready to drift into dreams as soft as the moon's own lullaby. The first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the horizon, pulling the night's velvet curtain aside like a shy stagehand. The moonlight balloon, a silvery gondola of woven canvas, began its gentle sigh as it lowered toward earth, its burners whispering a tired goodbye. A chorus of crickets, still half asleep, joined the soft rustle of the wind, turning the sky into a sleepy jazz club. Below, the meadow waited, a carpet of dew-kissed flowers glistening like tiny chandeliers. Even the clouds seemed to yawn, making room for the sunrise's golden spotlight. When the balloon's basket kissed the meadow, a faint thud resonated through the sea of petals, sending a spray of fragrant pollen into the air like confetti at a surprise party. The scent of wet earth rose, mingling with the sweet perfume of honeysuckle and the occasional whiff of damp horse manure, nature's own perfume sampler. A lone robin strutted by, cocking its head as if to say, "Nice landing, folks," before diving into the grass for breakfast. The fabric of the balloon brushed against the stems, leaving faint, silvery imprints that would fade by noon. Myra's grandfather chuckled, noting that the balloon had more grace than a drunken ballerina on a slick floor. Myra stepped out first, her boots sinking into the cool, squishy moss, feeling the morning's chill tickle her toes like mischievous elves. Her grandfather followed, his cane tapping a steady rhythm that reminded her of a metronome set to relaxation mode. He lifted his hat, tipped it toward the rising sun, and whispered, "We've swapped the stars for daisies, my dear, talk about a plot twist." The pair inhaled deeply, filling their lungs with the crisp, slightly metallic taste of dawn, a reminder that even the air can have a personality. A distant tractor rumbled, sounding like a lazy dinosaur, adding a low-key bass line to their quiet celebration. Together they gathered the calm of the night sky, cradling it like a newborn kitten that had just survived a midnight raid by mischievous raccoons. Myra imagined the calm as a Jedi mind trick, soothing any lingering worries with a gentle, "These are not the anxieties you're looking for." Her grandfather laughed, noting that the only thing more peaceful than this moment was his old vinyl collection of elevator music. They walked hand in hand across the meadow, each step releasing a faint pop of dew that sounded like tiny fireworks in the silence. The world around them seemed to pause, as if the universe had pressed the save button on this perfect instant. As the sun climbed higher, painting the meadow in amber and gold, Myra and her grandfather felt the day's promise settle on their shoulders like a soft blanket. The balloon, now deflated and folded, lay beside a patch of wild thyme, its canvas smelling faintly of burnt sugar and adventure. They shared a quiet joke about how the balloon would probably make a terrible Uber driver. No GPS, just wind and whimsy. With a final glance at the lingering stars, they turned toward the cottage, carrying the night's serenity into the bustling rhythm of daily life. And somewhere, a distant owl hooted a sleepy farewell, reminding them that even the night knows when to take a bow. The night draped Annanay like a woolen blanket, and the scent of damp earth rose from the cobblestones. Joseph and Etienne huddled under a flickering oil lamp, their cheeks rosy from the hearth's heat. They swapped bedtime stories about swallows that dived like arrows and clouds that floated like powdered sugar. The younger brother whispered, "What if we could catch a cloud and ride it to the moon?" A moth buzzed against the window, its frantic wings a tiny drumbeat to their dreaming hearts. Etienne chuckled, comparing their imagined contraption to a giant, lazy balloon that a lazy cat might mistake for a fish bowl. Joseph sketched a rough outline on a scrap of parchment, the charcoal smudging like sunrise on a soot-black sky. Their minds painted a gentle vessel of wicker and silk that would sigh upward, cradling their hopes like a mother's lullaby. The village dog, half asleep, snored so loudly it sounded like a distant thunderclap, adding comic timing to their reverie. Even the moon, half hidden behind a veil of mist, seemed to wink, as if approving their lofty folly. By morning, the brothers gathered discarded fabric, old wine barrels, and a sack of straw that smelled of sour yeast and barnyard musk. Etienne hammered the wicker frame, while Joseph tended a fire that hissed like a dragon with a cold sore, sending sparks dancing into the rafters. The workshop filled with the acrid bite of heated glue and the sweet, buttery scent of melted butter from a nearby kitchen, an odd but comforting perfume. Their neighbor, Madame Dubois, peered in and muttered that they were building a giant's diaper, a joke that made the boys grin despite the soot-stained hands. Yet every creak of timber and every puff of smoke felt like a secret hymn to the sky. When the sun rose, the makeshift balloon swelled, its belly puffing like a cartoon character after a giant meal of popcorn. The brothers stepped back, eyes wide, and imagined themselves as modern-day Icarus, except with a safety net of wool and a sense of humor. A passing traveler, hearing their excitement, shouted, "May the force be with you," and vanished into the market, leaving a lingering aroma of fresh baguettes. The balloon trembled, a nervous giggle of fabric, and the brothers felt a tickle of irony. They were trying to rise, while their village still smelled of mud and cheese. Yet the gentle rise of the vessel promised a dream that could lift even the heaviest of village gossip. As twilight returned, the brothers tucked the balloon under a tarp, its fabric sighing like a tired cat settling into a sunbeam. They lay on the floor, listening to the chorus of crickets and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, both sounding like lullabies for inventors. Joseph whispered, "Tomorrow we'll send our hopes skyward, and maybe even catch a glimpse of the stars we've been naming after saints." Etienne replied with a grin, "Or we'll just get a good story for the tavern, which is practically the same thing in this town." With that, they drifted into sleep, the village's cool night air wrapping them like a soft blanket, ready for the gentle adventure that tomorrow would bring. On a crisp dawn in Annonay, Joseph and Jacques Montgolfier slipped out of their modest workshop, their pockets heavy with bolts of rough linen and crinkly sheets of newspaper. The brothers lugged a battered basket, still smelling of soot and iron, from the forge where the fire had been coaxing a steady plume of warm air all night. They whispered about turning that invisible heat into a soaring beast, as if the hearth itself might sprout wings. A stray cat hissed at the stack of linen, sending a flurry of fibers into the air like confetti at a birthday party. The scent of melted wax and fresh pine mingled, promising both adventure and a touch of chaos. Neighbors gathered like a curious sitcom audience, clutching mugs of thick coffee and offering unsolicited advice that ranged from "add more paper" to "maybe try a dragon." Madame Dupont, the baker, handed them a loaf of bread, insisting the dough's yeasty aroma would sweeten the sky. Young Pierre, who could barely lift a spoon, tried to help lift the basket and ended up tangled in a skein of linen, looking like a pretzel in a wind tunnel. Their laughter rang across the courtyard, a chorus that turned the work into a communal play rather than a solitary experiment. Yet, when a sudden gust knocked the basket onto a pile of wet straw, the brothers learned that enthusiasm alone couldn't keep the fire from sputtering. The mishap left a sticky, smoky residue on their boots, a reminder that even good intentions can get a little gruddy. Undeterred, the Montgolfier brothers secured the linen envelope to the basket, fed the fire a fresh handful of charcoal, and watched the air inside swell like a belly after a hearty feast. The balloon shivered, then rose, hesitating at first as if it were a shy child peeking over a playground fence. It lifted just enough to lift the basket a few inches, then bobbed like a nervous dolphin before settling back onto the earth. The neighbors gasped, some clapping, others whispering that perhaps the balloon was just a fancy lantern. The brothers grinned, feeling the thrill of a first step, even if the ascent was more of a tentative wobble than a triumphant soar. The scene smelled of burnt sugar and damp wool, a pungent perfume that clung to the onlookers' throats and made them cough in rhythmic unison. Sparks crackled like tiny fireworks, sending bright specks into the twilight that faded as quickly as a pop-up ad. The balloon's fabric rustled, a soft sigh that reminded everyone of pages turning in an old storybook. As the warm air escaped in a hissing whisper, a faint taste of metal lingered on the brothers' tongues, a reminder of the forge's relentless heat. Even the cicadas seemed to pause, their chirps turning into a low, approving hum that filled the night with a gentle soundtrack. When the balloon finally settled, the brothers brushed soot from their sleeves, their faces lit by a mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration. They thanked the neighbors, who offered a round of applause that sounded suspiciously like a standing ovation at a theater premiere. The modest rise taught them patience, that even the grandest flights begin with a wobble and a few burnt eyebrows. With each setback, they tightened the linen, adjusted the fire, and promised to return with a balloon that would climb higher than a gull on a summer breeze. As the night deepened, the hearth's glow faded, but the warmth of shared hope lingered, ready to fuel the next daring ascent. As the sun yawned behind the rooftops of Annanay, a violet hush draped the cobblestones, and the air smelled of damp hay and roasting chestnuts. Jacques and Joseph Montgolfier stood beside their patched balloon, their faces lit by the flickering lantern like two nervous actors waiting for curtain call. Doubts fluttered around them like moths attracted to a cheap neon sign, buzzing in their ears with every creak of the wicker frame. The brothers exchanged a glance that said, "If this blows up, at least we'll finally have a reason to stop cleaning the attic." Yet the evening's gentle sigh hinted that something larger might be about to stir. Out of nowhere, a low rumble rolled across the valley, announcing a storm that seemed to have been summoned by a disgruntled weather god. Dark clouds swirled like an angry batter of whipped cream, and the wind slapped the streets with a slapstick rhythm that made the shutters shiver. The brothers' balloon, half filled with hot air and half with hope, shivered in the gusts as if it might launch itself into the next century. Villagers muttered about the irony of trying to rise, while the sky threatened to rain on their ambitions, and one old baker even whispered, "Even the clouds are trolling us today." Still, the storm's howl was a reminder that nature loved a good drama more than any theater troupe. Just as the first drops began to pepper the stone walls, the community huddled around a glowing fire in the town square, its orange tongues licking the night like a giant, friendly dragon. The smell of pine resin and smoked fish mingled with the earthy petrichor, creating a comforting cocktail for weary souls. Elder Marie, whose voice could coax a cat out of a tree, began singing lullabies that sounded suspiciously like a medieval version of a Disney ballad, soothing even the most skeptical onlookers. Children giggled, tossing crumbs of stale baguette into the flames, while the brothers leaned against a barrel, feeling the heat seep into their chilled bones. The fire's crackle became a metronome, syncing heartbeats and softening the storm's aggressive tempo. The lullabies wrapped around Jacques and Joseph like a warm blanket, coaxing their racing thoughts into a gentle waltz. Each note seemed to whisper, "Take it slow," like a cat stalking a laser pointer, urging them to abandon the reckless rush for a more tender touch. Inspired, they began sketching a new design on a soot-stained piece of parchment, replacing jagged metal spikes with smooth, silk-like cords that would cradle the balloon like a mother cradles a newborn. The brothers laughed at the irony. After all the hype, their breakthrough felt as humble as a backyard barbecue rather than a revolutionary flight. The crowd's soft hums turned into a chorus, encouraging the inventors to trust the wind's caress rather than its roar. When the storm finally passed, leaving puddles that reflected the fire's dying embers, the Montgolfier brothers lifted their revised balloon with a reverent sigh. The community watched, breath held like a Netflix binge watcher waiting for the next episode, as the balloon rose, slow, graceful, and a little wobblier than a toddler on a tricycle. It floated up, guided by the very breezes that had once threatened to tear it apart, proving that sometimes the softest approach wins the race. The night ended with a chorus of cheers, a few clinking mugs, and a promise that the next flight would be as gentle as a lullaby and as daring as a superhero's first leap. And so, under a sky now studded with twinkling stars, the whispers of wind carried a new legend, one that would lull future dreamers to sleep with the promise of soaring gently into the unknown. The first light of dawn painted the sky over Annanay in soft amber, and the giant envelope of the Montgolfier balloon puffed up like a sun-kissed hamster ball. Warm air hissed through the canvas, smelling faintly of burnt straw and the lingering perfume of fresh baked baguettes from a nearby bakery. Villagers gathered on the cobblestones, their breath forming little clouds that mingled with the balloon's swelling belly. Children shouted, their voices crackling like sparklers, while the older men tipped their caps in reverent awe. Even the rooster on the church steeple seemed to crow a slower, more ceremonial beat, as if announcing a historic sunrise show. Joseph and Jacques Montgolfier, wearing patched waistcoats and shoes that had seen more river crossings than ballroom dances, climbed the rickety wooden ladder with a mix of excitement and nervous swagger. Jacques muttered, "If we don't come back, at least we'll have a great story for the afterlife." The guys who went up like a hot air kettle. Their hands brushed the rough rope, feeling the grit of countless trips to the market and the occasional stray goat hair. The brothers exchanged a quick, brotherly grin, the kind that says, "We've got this, unless gravity decides to pull a prank." As they settled onto the makeshift basket, a stray pigeon fluttered past, giving them a startled coo that sounded suspiciously like a tiny, feathery heckler. With a sudden whoosh, the balloon caught the morning breeze and began to rise, the canvas groaning like an old pirate ship pulling away from port. Below, the crowd's cheers rose in a rolling wave, mingling with the clatter of horse hooves and the distant clang of the town bell. The world slipped away in a gentle, buttery glide, the brothers feeling the subtle pressure of altitude as if the sky were giving them a soft, invisible hug. The scent of earth grew fainter, replaced by a crisp, high-altitude tang that reminded them of fresh-cut pine and the faint metallic bite of adventure. Even the sun seemed to tilt a little, casting a golden halo around the balloon, as if the universe itself were applauding their daring. Spectators below gaped with mouths open wide enough to swallow the entire horizon, some clutching their rosaries while others clutched their smartphones. Yes, even in 1783, a few lucky inventors had a crude camera obscura that captured the moment like an 18th-century Instagram story. An elderly baker whispered, "Next they'll be flying to the moon, like those lunatics in Jules Verne's novels," prompting a chuckle that echoed across the fields. A group of soldiers in crisp uniforms performed a half-hearted salute, their polished boots clicking against the stone like a metronome set to awesome. The irony was not lost on the brothers. They had spent years feeding the balloon with hot air, and now it was the crowd that was being fed a spectacular visual feast. Somewhere in the distance, a fiddler began a jaunty tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening bars of a modern pop anthem, proving that even history loves a good remix. As the balloon drifted higher, the brothers felt a serene weightlessness that made the earlier nervous jitters melt into pure, buttery calm. The world below turned into a patchwork quilt of fields, rooftops, and the occasional stray cow that looked up as if asking for a ride. Jacques whispered, "We've turned a dream into a sunrise selfie," and Joseph laughed, noting that their ascent was the ultimate bedtime story for anyone who ever stared at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond. The balloon floated on, a silent promise that imagination, when fed with warm air and stubborn determination, could lift even the most grounded of souls. When they finally began their gentle descent, the crowd erupted in applause that sounded like 1,000 tiny fireworks, sealing the moment as a tranquil climax to a shared, sky-born reverie. The balloon slipped down like a feather caught in a lazy summer breeze, its crimson envelope brushing the low clouds before kissing the meadow below. A chorus of crickets greeted its arrival, their chirps rising like a tiny orchestra of applause. The grass, still damp with morning dew, released a sweet, earthy perfume that clung to the brothers' shirts. As the basket touched the soft earth, a puff of stale hay and burnt wool rose, reminding everyone that even triumph can smell a little like a campfire gone rogue. The sky above blushed pink, as if the sun itself were winking at the daring descent. Joseph and Jacques staggered out of the basket, their faces smeared with soot and astonishment, looking as if they'd just returned from a wild night at a medieval rave. Villagers swarmed around them, slapping backs and tossing wildflowers that burst with the scent of honey and hay. One old farmer, chewing on a piece of stale bread, declared, "These boys have finally given us a ride that doesn't involve a horse and a very angry goat." Laughter rippled through the crowd, mixing with the distant clank of a blacksmith's hammer, turning the meadow into an impromptu festival. Even the local priest, normally as solemn as a stone statue, cracked a grin and whispered a prayer that the next flight wouldn't involve any runaway chickens. That evening, the tale of the soft landing drifted into homes like a warm blanket, becoming the lullaby mothers hummed while rocking cradles. The melody, simple as a tin whistle and as catchy as a modern pop hook, slipped onto the villagers' imaginations like a vinyl record on repeat. Grandchildren would later swear they could hear the balloon's sigh in the rustle of wheat, a gentle reminder that humans once floated like balloons in a world still grounded by oxen. Even the town's new tavern, named the Feathered Descent, played the tune on a battered piano, its notes mingling with the clink of mugs and the faint smell of spilled ale. In this way, the brothers' quiet triumph turned into a generational soundtrack, as timeless as a Netflix binge but far more soothing. Night settled over the meadow, painting the sky in deep indigo speckled with glittering stars that seemed to wink at the balloon's ghost. A soft, cool breeze carried the lingering scent of burnt canvas and fresh earth, coaxing the listeners to inhale the night like a calming tea. Crickets resumed their serenade, this time harmonizing with the distant hoot of an owl that sounded suspiciously like a low bass line in a lo-fi beat. The meadow, now illuminated by fireflies blinking like tiny lanterns, felt like a giant living lullaby that wrapped the world in a gentle embrace. As the brothers' story faded into the night, the air itself seemed to sigh, inviting every weary heart to settle under the same sky they had once touched. And so, the soft landing became more than a moment. it became a promise that every ascent is followed by a gentle return. Parents point to the same horizon, reminding their children that the sky is a playground, but the meadow is always ready to catch you when you fall. The wind whispers the brothers' names, turning their adventure into a bedtime mantra that eases restless minds. Under that same blanket of stars, listeners can close their eyes, feeling the faint rustle of fabric and the sweet, grassy scent of the meadow below. With each breath they drift into sleep, cradled by the very lullaby that once carried a balloon and two daring brothers safely back to earth. The year was 1865, and London's sky hung low like a soot-stained curtain, the air thick with the sour bite of coal smoke. In the cramped attic of the Whitmore townhouse, young Eleanor brushed cobwebs from a forgotten trunk, her fingertips tingling from the dust that smelled like old books and damp wool. There, tucked beneath a moth-eaten shawl, lay a battered brass telescope, its polished lenses dulled by decades of neglect. She lifted it with a gasp, half expecting a ghost of a Victorian astronomer to pop out and demand a proper cleaning. Instead, the only thing that greeted her was the faint clatter of a streetcar rattling on iron rails far below, a reminder that the stars were still there, just hiding behind the fog. Eleanor set the instrument on a wobbly wooden stool, the legs squeaking like a chorus of nervous crickets. As she polished the glass with a rag borrowed from the kitchen, a rat scurried across the floor, leaving a greasy trail that glittered in the dim lantern light. The telescope's brass fittings were nicked and stained, yet when she peered through, the world narrowed to a single, stubborn pinprick of light that seemed to wink at her from a time before Dickens. She imagined the great astronomers of old, Newton, Galileo, standing shoulder to shoulder with her, perhaps whispering, "Nice find, kid, but you've got a lot of cleaning to do." A sudden gust of wind rattled the attic window, sending a flurry of soot particles dancing like tiny, disgruntled fireworks. The next afternoon, Dr. Harold Finch arrived at the Whitmore door, his coat dripping with the perfume of rain-soaked London and a pocket watch that ticked louder than the city's clamor. He examined the telescope with a practiced eye, muttering that the instrument was older than Queen Victoria's favorite hat and twice as stubborn. With a wry smile, he warned Eleanor that the city's smog was the modern equivalent of a dragon-breathing soot, making stargazing feel like trying to watch Game of Thrones through a frosted window. Yet he also spoke of the Royal Observatory's new light cleaning project, a fanciful scheme to coax the heavens back into view, and he handed her a battered star chart that smelled faintly of ink and ambition. Eleanor laughed, half in disbelief, half in hope, realizing that her attic discovery had just become a passport to a sky she'd only ever seen in the back of a penny dreadful. That night, armed with a candle that sputtered like a nervous firefly, Eleanor set the telescope on the roof of the Whitmore house, the wooden beams groaning under the weight of her anticipation. The city's din dulled to a low hum, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages turning into a distant percussion, while the smell of wet cobblestones rose like an earthy perfume. When she finally lifted the eyepiece, the universe unfolded. A tapestry of pinpricks, nebulae that glowed like spilled ink, and the Milky Way, a milky ribbon that seemed to say, "Hey, we're still here, despite the fog." Tears welled in her eyes, not from the cold but from the fierce joy of seeing a world beyond the soot, and she whispered a promise to the stars, "I'll bring you back, even if it means outwitting the smog itself." A stray cat, perhaps attracted by the candle's glow, leapt onto the roof and gave her a disdainful meow, as if to say, "Good luck, human, you'll need it." As dawn painted the Thames in a greasy gold, Elinor descended the stairs, her mind buzzing louder than the city's morning vendors hawking their wares. Dr. Finch met her with a grin, his eyes twinkling like the very constellations she'd just glimpsed, and he declared that her light in the fog would become the spark for a new society of night watchers. She imagined clubs of curious Londoners gathering in soot-blackened taverns, swapping stories of distant galaxies over pints of bitter ale, their laughter echoing against brick walls. The battered telescope, now polished and cherished, sat proudly beside a fresh stack of maps, ready to chart a rebellion against the choking haze that tried to hide the heavens. With a chuckle, Elinor tucked the instrument under her arm, feeling the weight of both brass and destiny, and stepped out into the bustling street, determined to reclaim the night sky, one clear night at a time. Elinor slipped out of London's soot-smudged streets just as the city's gas lamps flickered to life, her boots thudding against the uneven cobbles of a carriageway that smelled of horse sweat and coal dust. The coach rattled northward, climbing the rolling chalk downs of Wiltshire, where the air grew sweet with wild thyme and the distant hum of bees. As the skyline peeled away, the smog gave way to a bruised purple twilight that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who would listen. She felt a thrill, like the first bite of a crisp apple, as the world opened up beyond the soot-filled glow of the metropolis. The hills promised a quiet that her heart had been starving for, a place where the stars could finally be seen without a city's glare stealing the show. At a lone stone circle half buried in heather, Elinor discovered a ragtag band of Victorian stargazers, their jackets frayed but their eyes bright as polished brass telescopes. The leader, a wiry gentleman named Percival, who claimed his great-uncle once taught a young Charles Dickens how to spot Orion, greeted her with a grin that said, "We're not here to discuss tea, dear, look up." They set up brass lenses that clanked like a steampunk orchestra, their lenses fogged by breath and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. Laughter erupted when a nervous lady in a bustle tried to adjust a lens and instead knocked over a jar of marmalade, splattering orange goo across a polished brass arm. The circle's secret was simple. They met under the pretense of studying the heavens while swapping gossip that would make a modern reality TV show blush. Just as they aligned their instruments to capture the glow of Saturn, the sky ripped open with a sudden, thunderous roar that rattled the hills like a giant drum roll. Rain hammered the stone, turning the grass into a slick, muddy carpet that squelched under every footstep, releasing a pungent, earthy aroma of petrichor mixed with the metallic tang of wet iron from the telescope's fittings. Elinor clutched her coat tighter, feeling the cold seep into her bones, while Percival shouted over the clamor, "If the heavens won't cooperate, we'll make them." They huddled beneath a thatched shelter, sharing heated tea that tasted of burnt leaves and optimism, while the storm tossed lightning like a cosmic fireworks show. The tempest, though ferocious, forged a camaraderie that felt as solid as the ancient stones surrounding them. When the rain finally relented, the group faced a different kind of storm, the rigid expectations of Victorian society, which frowned upon women peering through telescopes as if they were spying on the king's private chambers. Elinor's lace-trimmed gloves trembled not from the chill, but from the knowledge that a lady daring to chart the stars could be labeled a hysterical lunatic, a phrase that sounded like a bad 90s sitcom title. Yet the circle's members, each wearing their own badge of rebellion, an overpolished monocle, a cravat dyed the wrong shade, a pocket watch set to adventure time, laughed at the absurdity. They joked that if they were any more out of place, they'd be the background extras in a Doctor Who episode set in 1865. Their humor, sharp as a needle, cut through the stiff decorum, allowing Alina to feel that the universe might just be large enough for a woman with a telescope and a dream. By the time the stars re-emerged, glittering like sequins on a midnight gown, Alina's resolve had solidified into something as unbreakable as the brass of their lenses. She exchanged a hand-crafted notebook filled with sketches of constellations for a promise, a pact to return each year, rain or shine, and to bring more curious minds into the fold. The circle toasted with mugs of steaming cider, the frothy foam spilling over like a galaxy in miniature, while the wind carried the distant hoot of an owl, a nocturnal applause. As she boarded the carriage back to London, Alina felt the weight of the city's smog lift, replaced by a lightness that only the night sky can bestow. She knew the road ahead would be paved with both ridicule and wonder, but she was ready to chart it, one star at a time. The London Astronomical Society rolled out its newest marvel, a brass-clad telescope that gleamed like a pirate's treasure chest under the foggy October sun. The massive tube perched on a crumbling hill, its polished gears ticking like a clockwork heart eager for the great comet of 1866. Alina felt the cold iron against her palm, the scent of oil and old leather mingling with the damp earth. Around her, murmurs rose like a choir of steam whistles, each voice a mix of awe and the faint whiff of cigar smoke. It was a scene worthy of a Dickens novel, if Dickens had ever bothered with telescopes instead of workhouses. Alina's new companions, Mr. Pritchard, a retired railway clerk with a habit of quoting Shakespeare, and Miss Lottie, whose laugh could shatter glass, gathered beneath the brass beast. The wind sang through the pine needles, rattling the observatory's shutters like an impatient audience waiting for the show. They tasted the metallic tang of anticipation as the night sky darkened, the distant hoot of an owl punctuating their whispered calculations. Somewhere nearby, a horse-drawn carriage clattered over cobblestones, its wheels spitting up a spray of grime that smelled oddly like burnt toast. The hill felt both sacred and slightly ridiculous, as if the universe had set up a stage for a Victorian version of a Star Wars cantina. Just as the first star began to wink, a ragged courier burst onto the hill, his coat flapping like a moth caught in a gale. He shouted that the Crown Railway Board had approved a new line that would carve a scar across the hill, laying iron rails where the telescope now stood. The news hit Alina like a sack of coal, heavy, hot, and smelling faintly of soot and ambition. The idea of steel tracks chewing through the grass felt as absurd as a steampunk dragon crashing a tea party. Yet the clatter of distant hammers already echoed, a metallic chorus promising to drown out the comet's glow. Alina and her motley crew huddled under the telescope's shadow, plotting like a band of misfit Avengers, armed with nothing but a brass telescope and a pocket full of Victorian optimism. Mr. Pritchard suggested they petition the board with a sonnet, while Miss Lottie offered to bake a trifle for the chief engineer, because who can resist a good dessert? Alina, ever the pragmatist, suggested they hide the telescope's most delicate lenses in a barrel of pickled onions. The brine would preserve them, and the smell would deter any nosy inspectors. Their plans were as tangled as the railway's proposed tracks, but the absurdity made them laugh louder than the distant hammer blows. In that moment, irony draped itself over the hill like a velvet curtain, reminding them that history often prefers drama over preservation. When the first locomotive finally hissed up the slope, the brass telescope stood defiantly, its polished surface catching the setting sun like a stubborn eye refusing to blink. Elinor felt a surge of bittersweet pride. Even if the hill were scarred, the memory of that night would linger like the lingering perfume of a Victorian perfume shop after a rainstorm. The comet, bright and fleeting, streaked across the heavens, a reminder that some wonders outshine even the most relentless progress. As the iron rails settled into the earth, a stray sparrow landed on the telescope's tube, chirping a jaunty tune that sounded suspiciously like a 19th-century pop song. And so, with a mix of triumph and melancholy, the society vowed to keep looking upward, because no amount of steel could dim the human urge to stare at the stars. The night the comet slithered into the heavens, Elinor slipped on her soot-stained boots and marched toward the lonely hill that the Royal Astronomical Society had christened Star Watch. She hoisted the brass-capped telescope like a knight would a lance, her breath fogging in the chill as the wind snatched at her skirts. The village below muttered about the devil's fireworks, but Elinor only heard the clink of copper gears and the promise of discovery. With a wink that could rival a Victorian wink-wink, she rallied the ragtag crew, 2 scholars, a chimney sweep, and a mischievous boy named Pip, into a daring night shift. "If the heavens are throwing a party, we'll be the bouncers," she declared, and the hill suddenly felt like a backstage pass to the cosmos. The hilltop was a patchwork of damp grass, rusted iron, and a telescope that smelled faintly of oil and old tea. Society members unfurled parchment scrolls, their ink still glistening like fresh rain, while Elinor calibrated the instrument with the precision of a watchmaker fixing a pocket watch. A brass bell rang every hour, its clang echoing against the distant church spire, marking the rhythm of data collection. As the comet's glow painted the clouds, the scholars scribbled numbers faster than a clerk at a railway ticket office, each figure a tiny victory over ignorance. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint, sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine that grew wild around the observatory's stone base. When the comet finally stretched its luminous tail across the sky, it looked like a celestial firework, an incandescent brushstroke that could have been drawn by a drunken Van Gogh. The tail's greenish-blue hue rippled like oil on a pond, and the crowd gasped, their faces illuminated by a light that made even the most stoic gentleman look like a child at a circus. Elinor's heart thumped in sync with the comet's pulse, each beat echoing the soft rustle of moths that dared to dance near the lanterns. The night air sang with crickets, the distant clatter of a carriage, and the occasional hoot of an owl that seemed to comment, "Well, that's a show." For a moment, the hill became a theater, the comet the star, and the society's instruments the paparazzi snapping forever-lasting snapshots of the universe's vanity. Amid the awe, a stray lantern, borrowed from a drunken barmaid's pocket, tumbled from Pip's careless grip and kissed the dry thatch of the observatory's roof. A sudden whoosh of flame licked the thatch, sending a plume of smoky ash spiraling like a miniature volcano over the telescope's polished lenses. Elinor's eyes widened and she shouted, "Fire, not the kind of star we wanted." As the crew scrambled, their boots slapping mud and their hands fumbling for buckets. The smell of burning straw mixed with the crisp night air, choking the sweet jasmine and replacing it with the acrid bite of charred wood. In the frantic scramble, the scholars knocked over a barrel of ink, turning the ground into a slick, inky swamp that made the whole scene look like a Victorian horror movie. Think The Haunting of Hill House meets The Goonies. Just as the fire threatened to devour the precious instrument, Eleanor grabbed a damp blanket, smothered the blaze, and declared, "We've saved the telescope, but the real comet is the one in our bellies now, full of panic and burnt toast." The crew, coughing and covered in soot, burst into nervous laughter, their relief as palpable as the warm glow of a hearth after a long winter. The comet's tail still arced above, indifferent to human folly, while the Society's data sheets, now half-inked and half-charred, still held the night's numbers, proof that curiosity can survive a bit of pyrotechnics. As dawn hinted pink on the horizon, Eleanor tipped her hat to the sky, whispering, "Next time we'll bring fire extinguishers instead of lanterns, maybe even a Netflix-style space rescue soundtrack." The hill settled back into quiet, the telescope standing proud like a tired hero, and the villagers below would later swear they heard a faint, triumphant ta-da carried on the wind. The last ember of the field camp's fire sputtered out, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke that curled like a shy cat above the telescope. Eleanor and her fellow amateurs bundled their sketches, ink-stained notebooks, and a battered brass spectroscope into a leather satchel and marched back to London. That night the Royal Astronomical Society's journal printed their findings, its pages smelling of oil lamp wax and fresh ink, a modest triumph that made even the most stodgy gentleman gasp. Readers across the empire unfolded the report like a treasure map, eyes widening at the description of a comet that winked like a mischievous child. The paper sparked a quiet revolution. Tea rooms buzzed with talk of nebulae, and corseted ladies dared to lift their parasols not for shade, but to glimpse the heavens. Eleanor slipped through the iron gates of her modest garden, the cobblestones slick with the day's rain and the faint perfume of wet lavender. Above her, the sky had shed the soot of the city, revealing a tapestry of stars that seemed stitched by a celestial tailor. She spread a blanket on the damp grass, its rough weave prickling her skin, and lay back, feeling the cool earth pulse against her spine. The constellations sang their ancient stories, each twinkle a note in a lullaby that soothed the ache of endless lectures and cramped laboratory benches. For the first time in months, Eleanor let the night swallow her worries, and a quiet grin curled her lips like a secret shared with the universe. The garden was alive with the soft chorus of crickets, their chirps cutting through the occasional clatter of a distant hansom cab. A moth, fat and moth-like as a Victorian waistcoat, flitted erratically around a lantern, its wings dusted with pollen and the faintest hint of mildew. The air tasted of damp soil and a faint metallic tang, as if the earth itself had exhaled after a long, exhausted sigh. Eleanor inhaled deeply, the scent of rosemary and the lingering stink of horse manure mingling in a strangely comforting perfume. She chuckled at the irony that the very grime that once dulled the city's glow now served as a backdrop for the brightest of skies. By morning, the journal's glossy pages fluttered through the streets like gossip, landing in the hands of a bored clerk who imagined the stars as the ultimate Netflix binge. Men in top hats paused their morning walks to stare up, squinting as if the heavens required a monocle to be properly appreciated. A cheeky cartoon in a penny weekly depicted a steam engine locomotive racing a comet, the caption reading, "Who needs a ticket to the Milky Way when you have a ticket to Paddington?" Even the Queen's ladies in waiting whispered about the new celestial fashion, suggesting silk gowns patterned after Orion's belt. The public's newfound fascination turned the night into a communal stage, where every flicker of light was applauded like a theater performance. Back in her garden, Elinor felt the night settle around her like a soft shawl, its darkness no longer a void, but a canvas for imagination. She traced the constellations with a fingertip, each star a promise that curiosity would never be extinguished by soot or scandal. The peace she found there lingered long after the sunrise painted the rooftops gold, a gentle reminder that the universe is both vast and intimately close. When she later walked the fog-laden streets of London, the echo of distant hooves seemed to sync with the rhythm of distant pulsars. And so, under the same starlit legacy that had guided sailors and poets, Elinor carried forward a quiet wonder that would outshine any industrial smoke. The harbor of Luminara lay swathed in a wool-thick fog that smelled of brine and old fish guts, making the wooden piers look like ghostly ribs of a leviathan. Myra, the shipwright with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt on her forearm, hammered the last iron band onto the prow of the first lantern ship. Her crew half-baked apprentices, a grizzled cook who still swore by his grandmother's stew, and a mute boy who could read the stars like a Netflix binge watcher reads spoilers, buzzed around like caffeinated fireflies. They sang a low chant that sounded suspiciously like a sea shanty version of Take on Me, hoping the melody would keep the mist at bay. Little did they know, a rival faction lurked in the shadows, eyeing the ancient lanterns like a cat eyeing a laser pointer. The lantern-lit vessels stood like colossal fireflies, their glass globes flickering with a blue-white glow that cut through the haze. Myra brushed soot from the hulls, the gritty ash scratching her fingertips like an over-enthusiastic exfoliant. The cook tossed a pot of stew into the air, the steam rising in ghostly ribbons that mingled with the lantern's smoke, making the air taste of pepper and regret. One apprentice tried to light a lantern with a match, only to set his boot on fire, prompting Myra to quip, "If you wanted fireworks, you should have joined the circus, not the crew." Laughter cracked over the clamor of ropes creaking and gulls shrieking, a soundtrack that would make even a medieval bard drop his lute in applause. When the final lantern was hoisted, its light pulsed like the heartbeat of an old dragon, promising safe passage through the cursed currents. Myra whispered the oath of the pilgrimage, a promise older than the city's cobblestones, to carry the lanterns to the shrine of Everglow, where myth said the light never waned. She felt a shiver run down her spine, half excitement, half the dread of stepping onto a stage without a script, like being cast as the lead in a Shakespeare play after a night of binge-watching reality TV. The crew tightened their belts, their boots sloshing in the salty muck, and the ship's timbers sang a low groan as if the vessel itself were stretching before a marathon. All the while, the rival faction's spies slipped through the fog, their eyes glinting with the same greedy sparkle that lit the lanterns. From a crumbling tower on the opposite cliff, the rival leader, Lord Varric, a man who collected cursed artifacts like some people collect vintage sneakers, snorted, "Those lanterns will be ours, and the pilgrimage will be the first episode of my new reality show. Survivor, see edition." His men, armed with rusted cutlasses and a suspiciously large sack of seaweed, crept toward the dock, their boots squelching in the mud like overripe grapes. Myra caught a glimpse of their silhouettes and felt the air thicken, the fog now tasting of iron and bad intentions. She barked orders, her voice cutting through the gloom like a laser sword in a low-budget sci-fi flick. The crew rallied, brandishing oars like swords, ready to defend the lanterns with the ferocity of cats defending a sunny windowsill. At the moment the first lantern ship slipped from its moorings, the harbor erupted in a chorus of creaking wood, clanking metal, and the distant, indignant honk of a gull that seemed to say, "Not today, buddy." Myra stood at the bow, wind whipping her hair into a wild halo, and felt the lantern's glow wash over her like a spotlight at a rock concert, only with fewer groupies and more existential dread. Behind them, the rival factions' cutlasses clanged uselessly against the hull, as if trying to swipe a selfie with a brick wall. The ship surged forward, its lanterns carving a path through the fog that made the night look like a watercolor painted by a tipsy monk. Myra laughed, half triumph, half nervous, thinking, if this turns into a disaster, at least we'll have a great story for the tavern. And then she added, and maybe a cameo from a mermaid who can sing karaoke. The lantern ship slipped silently into a silver veil that rolled across the sea like a giant, breathing duvet. Salt spray stung the sailors' eyes, mixing with the sour tang of old fish guts that clung to the deck. The captain, a grizzled veteran who swore he once outran a kraken, barked orders that were swallowed by the fog's muffled hush. Every wooden hull creaked in sympathy, as if the ships themselves were shivering in a cold bath. Even the gulls above seemed to have misplaced their GPS, circling like bewildered drones. From the mist emerged the soft susurrus of ancient sea spirits, their voices like cracked tea kettles whistling in a wind tunnel. Old Tom, the ship's cook, swore he heard his grandmother's lullaby, but with a salty twist that made his stomach churn. The crew huddled together, clutching rope and rum, their breaths forming ghostly ribbons that vanished as quickly as a Snapchat message. Some swore the spirits were testing their resolve, daring them to prove they weren't just a bunch of landlubbers with sea legs. A nervous laugh cracked the tension when a rookie shouted, "If it's a ghost, can it pay its share of the loot?" Lanterns bobbed like nervous fireflies, their flames sputtering and flaring in a rhythm that hinted at an unseen hand tugging the rigging. One lantern winked out, then reignited with a blue hue that made the deck feel like a sci-fi movie set. Think Star Trek meets Pirates of the Caribbean. The sailors stared, half in awe, half in dread, as the light seemed to pull the very wood toward a dark point beyond the horizon. A salty breeze carried the faint smell of ozone, like after a thunderstorm or a busted capacitor. Even the ship's cat, Sir Whiskers, arched his back and hissed at the invisible puppeteer. Irony dripped from the scene like the rain that never fell. The fleet, famed for its fearless raids, now tiptoed like toddlers in a nursery. The first mate, a man who once bragged about out-drinking a mermaid, now whispered prayers louder than a karaoke bar in a hurricane. Somewhere in the fog, a distant horn sounded, perhaps a phantom ferry or a lost Netflix trailer for a horror series. The crew exchanged glances that said, "We're in deeper water than the plot of Game of Thrones Season 8. Yet they kept marching forward, their boots squelching in the wet decks, because turning back would mean admitting the fog had outwitted them. Suddenly the unseen force yanked the flagship toward a jagged reef that rose like a tooth from the sea, its black rocks slick with algae and the stench of decay. The hull shuddered, sending a spray of brine and rusted metal into the air, and the sailors felt the ship's belly drop like a roller coaster gone rogue. With a collective gasp, the crew braced, their muscles tightening as if they were about to lift the whole fleet with sheer will. The fog thickened, swallowing the danger and the lanterns alike, leaving only the echo of a distant laugh, perhaps the sea spirit's final joke. As the ships creaked and the tide whispered, the captain muttered, "Well, that's one way to make a splash." And the crew, though trembling, prepared for whatever lay beyond the mist. The waning light of dusk draped the sea like a tired shawl, and the lantern ships slipped through the gloom on a hush of creaking timber. Captain Marlowe barked orders, his voice cracking like a weathered gramophone, while the crew adjusted the flickering lanterns that bobbed like fireflies in a bottle. Salty spray stung their eyes, and the scent of brine mixed with the sour tang of old rope, reminding them they were far from any tavern's warm hearth. A distant gull cried out, its mournful wail echoing the crew's nervous chuckles about navigating by the glow of a dying candle. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the ships to find their way. Soon the hulls shivered as they brushed against something that sang a glassy chime, a reef hidden beneath the surface like a secret glittering under a blacklight. The coral rose in jagged spires, each shard reflecting the lantern's glow into a kaleidoscope of neon blues and sickly greens that made the sea look like a rave gone wrong. The crew swore, their curses tasting of seaweed and cheap rum, as the deck slicked with a slime that felt like melted cheese on their boots. Even the ship's cat, Sir Whiskers, leapt back with a yowl that sounded suspiciously like a 90s pop song lyric. The hidden reef was a beautiful nightmare, and the lanterns trembled as if they too sensed the danger. Embedded in the lantern's metal frames were ancient runes, etched deep enough to make a modern graffiti artist weep with envy. Marlowe squinted, his beard catching a stray drop of seawater that dripped onto the stone like a slow-motion tear. The crew gathered around, whispering theories that ranged from a pirate's cheat code to an alien Wi-Fi password, while the wind howled a tune that sounded oddly like a forgotten lullaby. With a sudden flash of insight, the ship's quartermaster, a former librarian, matched the symbols to a riddle about tides and stars, muttering, "If only my high school Latin paid off." The lanterns flickered in rhythm, confirming the solution as the reef's edge began to glow with a soft, welcoming light. Just as the puzzle clicked, the horizon erupted with the black silhouettes of the rival fleet, their sails billowing like angry eyebrows. Cannon smoke curled toward the moon, and the distant boom of artillery made the sea tremble like a giant's stomach. The rival captain, a notorious scoundrel known for his love of dramatic entrances, shouted a taunt that sounded suspiciously like a line from a medieval rap battle. Marlowe clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of his crew's hopes and the absurdity of fighting over a reef that sparkled like a disco ball. The air thickened with tension, the scent of gunpowder mixing with the lingering perfume of the coral's briny perfume. With a deft twist of the lantern's central crystal, the reef's hidden mechanisms shifted, raising a narrow channel just wide enough for the ships to slip through. The lanterns burst into a brilliant cascade of light, blinding the rival fleet long enough for Marlowe's crew to dash past, their laughter echoing like a chorus of mischievous sprites. As the last ship cleared the danger, the reef settled back into its glassy silence, leaving only the faint echo of a distant splash and the faint smell of burnt ozone. The crew cheered, their relief as palpable as the warm sun that finally broke through the clouds, and Marlowe muttered, "Next time we'll just bring a GPS." The night closed on a story that would be told in taverns for generations, complete with exaggerated heroics and a warning. Never underestimate a reef that looks like a giant's broken bottle. The reef lay like a tangled forest of coral, its shadows dripping with the smell of brine and old seaweed. Fog rolled in thick as a baker's dough, muffling the gulls' cries and turning the water into a gray soup. At the center of this murky maze, Myra knelt before the ancient lantern, its iron ribs cold and rusted like a retired war veteran. She brushed away centuries of grime with a grin that said, "Time to light up the night, old friend." The crew held their breath, their boots squelching in the mud as she struck the flint. The lantern erupted in a cascade of gold, scattering the fog like confetti at a surprise birthday party. Light rippled across the reef, turning the kelp into shimmering emerald ribbons that swayed to a silent symphony. A salty wind carried the scent of ozone and burnt oil, making even the toughest sailor sniff like a newborn. Myra's heart hammered like a drum in a marching band, each beat echoing the lantern's glow. The beacon's brilliance cut through the gloom, revealing the hidden channels that had haunted their maps for generations. Just as the crew began to celebrate, the horizon erupted with the black hulls of the rival fleet, their sails blacker than a coffee spill on a white shirt. Their captain sneered, shouting, "Nice lantern, but you'll need more than a nightlight to beat us." Myra laughed, brandishing the lantern like a medieval sword, and replied, "Sorry, no lightsaber upgrades here, just good old fire." Cannons barked, splintering wood and spraying sea foam that stung the eyes like pepper spray. The battle crackled with the irony of two parties fighting over a glow that was supposed to bring peace. When the smoke cleared, the lantern's beam fell upon a silhouette that had been hiding in plain sight, a forgotten island, its cliffs draped in vines like a giant emerald shawl. The island exhaled a sweet, earthy perfume of blooming orchids and wet stone, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of battle. Myra stepped onto its shore, feeling the sand grit between her toes like powdered sugar and grit. There, etched into a basalt altar, lay the true purpose of their voyage, a map to the heart of the sea, a repository of ancient knowledge that could calm any storm. The crew stared, mouths agape, as a chorus of crabs scuttled across the altar, clicking like an audience at a comedy club. With the island's secret uncovered, Myra raised the lantern once more, its glow now a promise rather than a warning. The crew, still dripping sea salt and adrenaline, cheered louder than a stadium full of football fans after a last-minute goal. They laughed about how a simple light had outwitted a fleet, proving that sometimes the best weapon is a well-timed flashlight. As they set sail toward the heart of the sea, Myra whispered, "May the force be with our compass," borrowing a line from a galaxy far, far away. The lantern flickered, casting playful shadows that danced like mischievous sprites, sealing the silent voyage with a glow that would echo through history. At the first blush of dawn, the lantern ships slipped into Luminara's harbor like shy fireflies returning home after a night of mischief. Their hulls, slick with salty foam and the faint stink of burnt pitch, glimmered against the amber sky, each lantern swaying like a nervous teenager at a prom. The crew, still buzzing from the secret they'd guarded on the hidden island, exchanged glances that said, "We survived, and we didn't even need a superhero cape." A lone gull squawked overhead, as if to announce the arrival of the most dramatic sunrise since the day the sun decided to take a coffee break. The water lapped against the docks with a sigh, welcoming the ships back to the calm that had defined their legacy. The rival faction, who had strutted into the island like a band of overconfident reality TV villains, now slunk away with their heads hung lower than a turtle on a beach. Their banners, once bright with boastful slogans, fluttered limp, soaked in the salty mist and the bitter taste of defeat. One of their captains muttered something about bad luck while stepping on a slippery plank that squelched like a wet sock, prompting a chorus of snickers from the Luminara crew. Even the sea seemed to chuckle, sending a playful wave that knocked a stray lantern into the water, where it bobbed like a lost emoji. Ironically, the humbled rivals left as quietly as they had arrived, their ambition evaporating faster than a latte left out in the sun. Back on the dock, the crew erupted into a celebration that smelled of roasted fish, spiced rum, and the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine that clung to the pier railings. Drums pounded a rhythm that could have awakened the dead, while a fiddler tossed in a few off-key notes that sounded suspiciously like the opening riff of a classic rock anthem, Stairway to Heaven, but with more sea foam. Laughter bounced off the stone walls, and a few sailors dared each other to taste the mysterious, briny goo that oozed from a cracked barrel. Turns out it was just old fish sauce, but the bravest swore it tasted like victory. The mayor, a stoic woman with a scar shaped like a crescent moon, raised a glass of sparkling water and declared, "May our silence be louder than any war cry." The crowd roared, their cheers echoing like a chorus of ancient sea spirits. As the sun climbed higher, its golden fingers brushed the harbor, casting long shadows that danced like ghostly performers in an old theater. The lanterns, now dimmed, lay scattered like fallen stars, each one a reminder that the silent voyage had been more than a mission. It was a promise to future generations. Children perched on the dock's edge, eyes wide, asked if the ships would ever sail again, to which the oldest sailor replied, "Only when the world needs a quiet hero, not a flashy blockbuster." The air was thick with the scent of seaweed and the faint hum of distant gulls, a soundtrack that would forever accompany the tale of humility and hidden strength. In that moment, Luminara felt like a living museum, preserving the calm legacy like a priceless artifact behind glass, only less dusty and more salty. When night finally draped its velvet cloak over the harbor, the crew gathered around a crackling fire, roasting sea spice kebabs that sizzled like a mixtape of sizzling pop culture references. One sailor with a grin wider than a pirate's treasure map joked, "If we were in Game of Thrones, we'd be the quiet ones who actually win the throne, no dragons needed." The firelight flickered on their faces, highlighting the grime of battle and the gleam of triumph, a gritty reminder that heroes often smell like burnt rope and fish guts. They toasted to the silent voyage, promising to keep its story alive, even if future historians mistake the lanterns for Instagram hashtags. And as the embers faded, the harbor whispered back, "Sleep tight, brave ones, tomorrow the sea writes a new chapter, and you'll be ready, quietly of course." The night draped the world in a sheet of liquid silver as Leora, a wandering sage with a satchel full of scrolls, slipped onto the cracked path. She followed the old map that promised a temple where the moon sang lullabies to stone. Each step kicked up dust that smelled like forgotten incense and stale goat cheese, a scent that made her grin despite the chill. Ahead, the citadel rose like a jagged crown, its basalt walls etched with weathered glyphs that glowed faintly in the lunar glow. Even the wind seemed to tip its hat, whispering, "Welcome, traveler, to the place where time takes a coffee break." At the massive gate, a figure hunched over a lantern emerged, his robe frayed like an ancient tapestry. He introduced himself as Kyan, the gate's quiet guardian, whose beard could hide a small village and whose eyes twinkled like fireflies on a budget. Kyan shuffled a stone slab with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a creaking floorboard in a haunted mansion. He offered Leora a cup of tea brewed from moss and moonlight, warning that the brew tasted like regret and pine needles. Leora laughed, noting that even the monk's humor was drier than the Sahara in a desert documentary. Kyan's warning dripped with the weight of centuries. When the moon swells to its fullest, the ruins awaken with echoes that have never learned proper table manners. He described the echoes as mischievous spirits that bounce off columns, replaying the clatter of armor and the sighs of forgotten lovers like a badly tuned vinyl record. The air grew thicker, scented with wet stone and the faint metallic tang of ancient blood, enough to make a vampire reconsider its diet. Leora felt a shiver crawl up her spine, half excitement, half the realization that she might have to dodge spectral arguments about who stole the last piece of cake. She tightened her cloak, ready to face whatever ghostly gossip the moon might conjure. Stepping through the courtyard, Leora's boots sank into a mire of moss that squelched like overripe fruit, releasing a pungent perfume of decay that made her eyes water. She inhaled the cool night air, peppered with the distant hoot of owls and the occasional squeak of a rat dragging a breadcrumb, nature's version of a soundtrack. The stone pillars rose like skeletal giants, their cracks filled with lichens that glowed green, reminding her of a sci-fi movie set gone rogue. She whispered a calming mantra, letting its rhythm blend with the rustle of leaves, turning the ruins into a giant, silent yoga studio. Even the lingering echoes seemed to soften, as if the moon itself were humming a lullaby to soothe the restless stones. At the heart of the temple, Leora discovered an altar bathed in moonlight, its surface slick with dew and the occasional spider web that glittered like cheap sequins. She placed her hand on the cold slab, feeling the pulse of centuries, like a heart monitor stuck on a low battery beep. A soft chuckle rose from the shadows, and a voice that sounded suspiciously like a 90s sitcom laugh track announced, "You've found the Wi-Fi of the ancients." Leora smiled, realizing that peace isn't the absence of noise but the ability to dance with it, even if the dance partner is a ghost with terrible taste in music. With the moon climbing higher, she turned back toward the gate, carrying the quiet triumph of a night well spent, and a story she'd tell over campfire s'mores, minus the marshmallow-toasted ghosts, of course. Leora slipped her sandal onto a marble slab that sang a low, mournful creak, while Kyan trailed a lantern that flickered like a nervous firefly. The cracked corridors stretched ahead, each fissure catching the moon's silver blade and turning it into a jagged runway for dust motes. A soft breeze slipped through a broken column, carrying the ghostly hum of a forgotten choir that sounded oddly like a karaoke night gone wrong. Their footsteps echoed, a rhythmic slap stomp that seemed to keep time with the spectral singers. Somewhere in the distance, a stone statue winked at them, its marble grin as crooked as a meme face emoji. They followed a trail of moonlit mosaics, each tile a burst of cobalt, amber, and vermilion that painted the floor like a giant, ancient Instagram filter. The patterns swirled into a map of constellations, guiding them deeper into the heart of the ruins. Suddenly, a crumbling archway loomed, its keystone wobbling like a nervous Jenga piece about to topple. Leora hesitated, feeling the cool sweat of anticipation, while Kyan cracked a joke about needing a spare arch from the hardware store. Together they ducked under the collapsing stone, the dust puffing up like a sneeze in a library. Beyond the arch, a hidden basin lay in a shallow depression, its surface as still as a cat that's just heard the can opener. The water mirrored the night sky, catching every star and throwing it back with a mischievous sparkle that made Kyan swear he saw a tiny superhero cape fluttering across Orion. They knelt, their reflections distorted by a stray leaf that floated like a lazy alien spacecraft. The silence pressed in, testing their patience as if the basin were a stern librarian demanding they whisper their thoughts. Leora laughed, splashing a little, and the ripples sang a brief, watery version of the choir's chant, turning the solemn scene into a midnight jam session. Echoes rose from the marble walls, a chorus of voices that seemed to argue about the proper pronunciation of marble. Some insisted on marbell, others on marble. The sound bounced off the columns, creating an acoustic illusion that made Kyan feel like he was inside a giant, ancient speaker system. A faint scent of wet stone and ancient incense rose, mixing with the metallic tang of Kyan's nervous sweat. The duo pressed on, their shadows dancing on the walls like two noir detectives in a low-budget film. Ironically, the deeper they went, the quieter the world outside became, as if the night itself had pressed the mute button on the city's chaos. At the end of the corridor, the moonlight pooled into a final alcove, bathing a solitary marble statue of a forgotten goddess in ethereal glow. The statue's eyes seemed to follow them, a silent reminder that even stone can hold a sense of humor. Its left hand held a tiny, cracked lyre, as if ready for an impromptu jam. Leora and Kyan exchanged a look, both feeling the weight of history settle like a comfortable blanket, albeit one with a few moth holes. They turned back, their steps now confident, the earlier obstacles feeling like playful riddles rather than threats. As they exited, the wind carried the choir's final note, a soft, lingering hum that promised more moonlit mysteries to come. The night draped itself over the crumbling columns like a velvet cloak, and the moon hung low, a silver coin tossed into an ancient sky. Our wanderer, clutching the monk's lantern, felt the weight of centuries press against his shoulders, as if the stones themselves were whispering gossip about forgotten emperors. A soft breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant pine, mixing with the faint, metallic tang of old incense that still clung to the ruins. He recalled the monk's words, "Let the light be your compass, and the darkness your teacher," a mantra that sounded oddly like a yoga class slogan. With each step, his boots crunched over broken mosaics, sending tiny clouds of dust that glittered like powdered sugar in the lantern's glow. Suddenly the lantern's flame hiccuped, flickering as though a mischievous sprite had taken a sip of espresso. Shadows leapt from the stone arches, twisting into silhouettes that resembled ancient spirits performing an impromptu ballet. The air grew cooler, and the night's chorus, crickets, distant owl hoots, and the occasional rustle of a nocturnal raccoon provided a percussive beat. Our hero blinked, feeling the light wobble like a nervous stand-up comic, and realized the lantern was begging for attention. He laughed half in disbelief, half in awe, as the shadows wove jokes about lost kings and overdue taxes across the ruined walls. At the heart of the courtyard lay a low altar of 3 stone slabs, each etched with a different rune that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The puzzle demanded they align the stones so the lantern's beam could pass uninterrupted, a task that felt like arranging a cosmic Jenga tower. He lifted the first slab, feeling the cold bite of basalt against his palm, and heard a low thud as it settled into a shallow groove. The second stone, smoother as river-worn marble, resisted at first, then clicked into place when he tapped it in rhythm with the night's chirping chorus. When the final slab settled, a soft sigh echoed through the ruins, and the lantern's flame steadied, bathing the space in a warm, amber glow. The true obstacle, he realized, was not the darkness but the impatience humming inside his chest like a badly tuned drum. By listening to the night's rhythm, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl, the lantern's sigh, he learned to sync his breath with the world's pulse. Trusting the soft glow of his own heart, he let go of the urge to force the light, allowing it to breathe on its own terms. The ancient spirits, now content, retreated into the stone, leaving behind a faint perfume of jasmine and old parchment. In that quiet moment, the monk's gift transformed from a mere tool into a companion, reminding him that every flicker carries a story waiting to be heard. He chuckled, thinking how this night felt like a low-budget Star Wars scene where the Force was replaced by a flickering lantern and a stubborn puzzle. The ruins, once foreboding, now resembled a cozy living room where ghosts might gather for tea and gossip about modern traffic jams. He tucked the lantern under his arm, feeling its steady glow like a pocket-sized sunrise, ready for whatever mischief the night might throw next. As he turned to leave, a stray moth buzzed past, its wings scattering silver dust that made the shadows grin mischievously. With a final nod to the moon, he whispered, "May the night be ever in your favor," and stepped into the path that led back to the village, heart alight. Leora slipped through the last crumbling archway and found herself standing before the heart of the moonlit sanctum. The stone altar rose like a tired giant, its rough surface slick with centuries of rain and dust. Above, the moon perched at its zenith, spilling a torrent of silver that turned every jagged edge into a gleaming blade of light. A soft wind rustled the ancient vines, scattering the scent of wet moss and distant campfire smoke. She felt the night's pulse thrum against her skin, like a low bass line in a forgotten soundtrack. The moon's glow pooled on the altar, turning the cold stone into a luminous stage for a spectacle no one had booked. Suddenly, a translucent figure shimmered into view, the first keeper of the temple, looking as bewildered as a cat in a laser pointer convention. He wore robes that seemed woven from moonbeams and dust, and his eyes sparkled with the same mischievous glint as a mischievous teenager spotting a Wi-Fi signal. "Welcome, traveler," he intoned, his voice echoing like a distant gong mixed with a faint pop song chorus. Leora laughed, half in awe, half because she imagined the keeper had just been summoned by a cosmic Alexa. The keeper drifted closer, his footsteps silent on the altar, and brushed a hand, invisible yet somehow warm, across the ancient carvings. He whispered a blessing that tasted like honeyed night air and sounded like the rustle of parchment in a library haunted by scholars. "May these ruins echo calm for every moonlit wanderer," he said, his words wrapping around her like a soft blanket against the chill. The scent of ancient incense rose from the cracks, mingling with the earthy perfume of damp stone, making Leora feel both soothed and slightly nauseated by the mustiness. A gentle chorus of crickets joined the scene, as if the entire night had decided to sing a lullaby just for her. Leora inhaled the cool, silver-tinted air and felt a wave of profound peace wash over her, as if she'd just found the cheat code for stress relief. The stone beneath her feet seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, reminding her that even ruins have rhythm. She imagined future travelers, poets, thieves, bored tourists stumbling upon this same altar, each receiving the same quiet benediction. The moon, ever the overachiever, lingered a moment longer, casting shadows that danced like lazy cats on the walls. In that instant, the ruins felt less like a tomb and more like a cozy living room with a view of the cosmos. When the apparition finally faded, leaving only the faint echo of his blessing, Leora tipped her hat to the night sky as if thanking a director for a perfect scene. She turned to leave, stepping over a puddle that smelled faintly of stale ale, a reminder that even sacred places have their messy sides. As she walked away, a distant owl hooted a riff that sounded suspiciously like the opening theme of a classic sci-fi series, adding a dash of irony to the solemnity. The moon, satisfied with its performance, began its slow descent, promising to return for an encore. Leora smiled, knowing that the heart of the moonlit sanctum would forever beat in quiet harmony for anyone daring enough to wander under its silver spotlight. The first blush of dawn stretched pink fingers across the horizon, coaxing night's shadows into a shy retreat. Leora and Kyan stepped down the ancient stone stair, the lantern in Kyan's hand humming a steady, warm glow like a contented cat. Their boots crunched on centuries-old gravel, each step echoing like a drum roll in a forgotten theater. A cold wind teased the hair at the back of their necks, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and wet earth. Even the moon, embarrassed by the sunrise, slipped away behind a veil of gold. Behind them, the ruins dissolved into silhouettes, the broken columns and moss-clad arches becoming mere memory against the brightening sky. The stone walls, still damp from the night's dew, released a sour, metallic tang that reminded Kyan of old gym socks left in a locker. Crickets, those relentless nighttime DJs, gave their final chirps before surrendering to the day's chorus of birds. A distant owl hooted a sarcastic goodbye, as if saying, "Nice try, humans, but the night still got jokes." Leora inhaled the cool air, feeling it fill her lungs like a freshly opened soda can. The tranquility they had harvested in the moonlit corridors clung to them like a soft blanket, refusing to be shrugged off by the brightening world. Kyan chuckled. "I feel like we just binge-watched a whole season of Ancient Mysteries and survived the cliffhanger." Their hearts beat at a leisurely tempo, a rhythm that would make a yoga instructor weep with envy. Even the lantern, now a mellow ember, seemed to sigh in relief, its flame no longer fighting the wind, but simply enjoying a lazy sunrise latte. The humor of their adventure, two explorers stumbling over a stray rat's droppings while searching for enlightenment, added a gritty, human flavor to the mythic moment. As they emerged onto the path that led back to the valley, the world below greeted them with the chatter of market stalls and the smell of fresh bread, a stark contrast to the stone-cold silence they'd left behind. Their spirits, newly polished by the night's quiet, sparkled like a freshly buffed shield in a medieval RPG. Leora's smile widened, recalling a line from a classic film. "May the Force be with you. except here the force was replaced by a gentle sunrise and a sturdy pair of walking shoes. The irony was not lost on them. After braving ghosts of the past, they now faced the mundane task of paying for a cup of coffee. Yet the calm lingered, a secret pocket of peace tucked into their backpacks. Dawn's gentle return wrapped around them like a silk robe, stitching together night's mysteries with day's promises. Their footsteps echoed a quiet hymn, each tap a reminder that even the oldest stones can't hold onto silence forever. With hearts quieted and spirits renewed, Leora whispered to the wind, "We've been here, we've seen the ghosts, now let's see what brunch looks like." Kyan laughed, nudging her toward the rising sun, ready to trade ancient riddles for modern memes. And so they walked on, carrying the night's calm into the bright, bustling world, like a hero returning from a quest with a souvenir. Only this souvenir smelled faintly of moss and moonlight.